I didn't wake up that morning expecting my career, my friendships, and my sense of reality to tilt sideways. It was supposed to be a normal Tuesday. Coffee, laptop, calendar reminders, stacked back to back. My daughter's lunch half-eaten on the counter. My husband already gone to work, as usual. Life moving in the quiet, predictable way it always did. My name is Rachel, and this is how my team pretended to support me. Then I saw the Slack channel. At work, everyone had been telling me the same thing for weeks. You're doing great. You deserve this promotion. We've got your back. They said it in meetings. They said it in private DMs. They said it with encouraging, thumbs-up reactions and smiley faces. They said it loudly enough that I started believing it. I worked at a mid-sized tech company. Not flashy, not famous. The kind of place that talks about culture more than it practices it. I'd been there 6 years. Long enough to know how things really worked. Long enough to have trained half the people who now sat beside me on Zoom calls pretending we were equals. When our department head announced she was stepping down, people started looking at me differently. Not openly, subtly. They tagged me more, asked my opinion more often, let me lead meetings without officially naming it. HR scheduled a career alignment conversation that didn't feel accidental. I wasn't naive. I knew promotions create tension, but I genuinely believed my team supported me. We'd survived layoffs together, late nights, product launches that nearly broke us. I had covered for them when their kids were sick, took blame when projects went wrong. I had been loyal in the quiet ways that don't show up on performance reviews. So when my manager, Evan, told me I was being considered seriously for the role, I went home that night and let myself imagine it. Just a little. I imagined finally paying off our credit card debt. I imagined not panicking every time the school sent an email about another optional fee. I imagined my husband looking at me with something other than distracted pride. I didn't imagine what came next. It happened because of a mistake, a small one. That afternoon, I was rushing between meetings when Evan messaged me on Slack. Hey, can you jump into the leadership sync channel real quick? I clicked without thinking. For half a second, I thought Slack was glitching. The messages didn't make sense. The tone was off. Too casual. Too cruel. Then I noticed the channel name. Not the leadership sync. A private channel. One I wasn't supposed to see. It was called #Team Alignment. And my name was everywhere. Not tagged. Not mentioned. Respectfully. Discussed. I scrolled through and read. Every message landed quietly. No dramatic pause. No warning. Just sentence after sentence, rearranging everything I thought I knew. She's too emotional for that role. Rachel thinks she deserves it just because she's been here the longest. We need someone more balanced. She's going to play the mom card if she doesn't get it. I kept scrolling even though my hands had stopped feeling like they belonged to me. One message from Chris, someone I'd trained personally, sat right in the middle. I smile at her face because it's easier. But leadership? No way. Someone reacted with a laughing emoji. Another added, "She'll cry if we tell her the truth." I wouldn't cry, though. I sat there, staring, noticing small things that hurt more than the words themselves. The timestamps, the casual tone, how long this channel had existed. Months. This wasn't a reaction to my promotion chances. This was a habit. I noticed names. People who had messaged me that very morning asking how I was doing. People who had sent heart emojis when I mentioned being nervous about the process. People who had told me they were rooting for me. I scrolled up further. There was a conversation about my schedule, about how often I logged off to pick up my daughter, about how flexibility becomes an excuse when women get comfortable. Another message speculated whether my husband let me take the role if I got it. I closed my laptop. Then I opened it again, because I needed to know how deep it went. I didn't screenshot anything. Not yet. I didn't forward it. I didn't react. I just read. Quietly. Carefully. like someone reading their own autopsy. The worst part wasn't the insults. It was the planning. They were coordinating feedback, aligning stories, deciding how to phrase concerns so they sounded professional instead of personal. She's solid but not visionary. She lacks executive presence. She's great operationally but not strategically. Those phrases would go to leadership, HR, the decision makers, all while telling me to my face that I was doing great. My Slack notification chimed. A DM from Sarah. You okay? You've been quiet. Sarah had posted earlier in the channel. She's nice, but I don't trust her under pressure. I stared at her message for a long time. Then I typed, yeah, just busy. I didn't confront anyone that day. I finished my meetings, gave my updates, smiled when appropriate, turned my camera off when I needed to breathe without anyone watching. By the time I logged off, my head wasn't spinning. It was clear in a way that felt dangerous. At dinner, my daughter told me about a spelling test. My husband talked about a client issue. I nodded, responded, passed the salt. I didn't tell them what I'd seen. Not because I wanted to protect them, because I didn't know how to explain that the people I trusted at work had been pretending for months. That night, I lay awake thinking about all the moments that made sense now. The forced enthusiasm, the way feedback always sounded rehearsed, the subtle pauses when I spoke in meetings. I thought about the times I defended these people, times I told myself I was being paranoid, times I chose collaboration over confrontation. I thought about my mother, who had warned me years ago not to confuse professionalism with loyalty. The next morning, Evan scheduled a one-on-one. I joined the call early. He smiled the way managers do when they think they're in control. Rachel, he said, I just want to be transparent with you. That word, transparent, he told me leadership was leaning in another direction, that while my work was valued, there were concerns about my readiness. He used the same phrases I had read the day before: executive presence, strategic vision, long-term availability. I let him finish. Then I said something that surprised both of us. I know about the Slack channel. Silence. Not confusion. Not denial. Recognition. His face changed just enough. I'm not sure what you mean, he said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't even sound angry. I said, I was added to hashtag team alignment by mistake yesterday. I read everything. Another pause. He leaned back in his chair, like someone deciding how honest they could afford to be. Well, he said slowly, those were internal discussions. Internal. That was his defense. Not that it was wrong. Not that it was untrue. Just internal. I told him I needed time to process. He agreed quickly. Too quickly. After the call ended, my Slack started lighting up. People checking in, sending encouragement, acting like nothing had happened. I didn't respond. Instead, I did something I'd never done before. I opened a blank document and started writing names. Every message, every comment, every reaction. Because if there's one thing I've learned as a woman balancing work, marriage, and motherhood, it's this. Chaos doesn't always explode. Sometimes it organizes itself quietly. And I was done being the only honest person in the room. I didn't sleep much after that call. Not because I was spiraling, but because my mind kept doing something worse. It started organizing, replaying conversations, reframing smiles, sorting people into new categories I hadn't known I needed. By morning, I wasn't shocked anymore. I was observant. At work, shock gets you fired. Observation keeps you employed. I logged in at my usual time. Same greeting messages popped up. Morning, Rachel. Hope you're feeling better today. Let me know if you need anything. They sounded almost sweet now, like actors who didn't know the audience had already read the script. I responded normally. Short, neutral, friendly. I gave them nothing extra. While everyone else was busy reacting to tickets and discussing sprint timelines, I was watching patterns. who spoke first in meetings, who echoed whose ideas, who suddenly went silent when I joined a call. It became obvious quickly. The Slack channel wasn't just a place to vent. It was a coordination room, a rehearsal space. I noticed how feedback appeared in waves. Someone would introduce a concern in the private channel. 2 days later, that same phrasing would surface in a leadership meeting, delivered by someone who had never raised the issue before. They weren't disagreeing with me openly. They were erasing me collectively. That afternoon, Sarah scheduled a coffee chat. She framed it as support. She always did. When her face appeared on my screen, she smiled warmly, asked about my daughter, complimented my presentation from last week. Then she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice like she was sharing something confidential. "I just want you to know," she said, "that not everyone handles pressure the same way. Leadership is unforgiving." I nodded. She continued, "Sometimes people confuse being dependable with being decisive." That sentence came straight from the Slack channel, almost word for word. I let her finish, thanked her for her honesty, told her I appreciated her perspective. She looked relieved, like she had done her part. After the call, she sent me a message. "You took that really well." I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the Slack channel again. It was still there. I hadn't been removed, which told me something important. They thought I wouldn't do anything. Or worse, they thought I couldn't. I scrolled through newer messages. They were calmer now, less reckless, a little more guarded. Someone had noticed my silence. "Be careful what we put here," one message read. "She might be more sensitive than we think." Sensitive, that word again. I realized then that they weren't afraid of what they'd done. They were afraid of how I might react. That gave me leverage. At home, things started slipping in quieter ways. My husband, John, noticed I was distracted. He asked if everything was okay. I told him work was just busy. He nodded, already halfway back to his phone. We'd been like that for a while. Two people running parallel lives, checking in occasionally, assuming the other would speak up if something was really wrong. I almost told him that night. Almost. But something stopped me. Part of it was exhaustion. Part of it was pride. And part of it was the fear that if I said it out loud, it would become real in a way I wasn't ready for yet. The next day, HR emailed me. They wanted to check in about how I was feeling after the promotion update. I almost laughed. HR had been copied on several of the Slack conversations. Not directly, but enough context clues made it obvious. They weren't neutral observers. They were silent participants. Still, I agreed to the meeting. The HR manager, Linda, spoke gently. She used phrases like company values and psychological safety. She asked if I felt supported by my team. I answered honestly. I felt supported until I realized the support was performative. She blinked, asked what I meant. I told her about the Slack channel. She didn't look surprised. She looked inconvenienced. She said internal channels are often used for open discussion. She said feedback isn't always easy to hear. She said perception matters as much as intent. Then she said something that shifted everything. We have to consider how your reaction might affect team morale. My reaction, not the channel, not the coordinated behavior, not the months of deception. My reaction. I thanked her for her time, logged off, closed my laptop. For the first time since this started, I felt something close to anger. Not explosive. Focused. They weren't going to protect me. They weren't going to correct this. They were going to manage it quietly and hope I accepted my place. That night, after my daughter went to bed, John asked again what was wrong. This time I told him. Not everything. Just enough. I told him my team didn't want me promoted, that they had been pretending to support me, that I found out accidentally. He frowned, said that sounded awful, said office politics were brutal, said maybe it was a blessing in disguise. I asked him what he meant. Well, he said, you already do so much. Maybe it's not worth the stress. Maybe they're right that the role would be a lot. There it was. Not cruel, but familiar. I realized then that the narrative about me wasn't just happening at work. It had been forming quietly at home too. The dependable one, the capable one, the one who holds things together, but not the ambitious one, not the disruptive one, not the one who demands more. I didn't argue with him. I didn't defend myself. I went to bed early. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Chris messaged me privately. "Hey Rachel, do you have a minute?" Chris. The same Chris who had laughed in the Slack channel. The same Chris who said leadership wasn't for me. I said yes. He joined the call, looking uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact, clearing his throat too often. "I just wanted to say," he began, "that things might have gone a little too far." I waited. "I think some people misunderstood your intentions," he said, "and maybe the channel got unproductive." Unproductive. I asked him why he was telling me this now. He hesitated, then said, "There's talk that leadership might open another role. Something adjacent. Less pressure. An alternative. A consolation prize." I understood immediately. They weren't trying to make things right. They were trying to contain me. I told him I'd think about it. After the call, I sat quietly for a long time. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I forwarded the Slack channel to my personal email. All of it. Every message. Every reaction. Every timestamp. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it yet. I just knew I needed to own the truth before someone else decided how it would be told. That afternoon, Evan announced in a team meeting that leadership decisions would be finalized soon. He thanked everyone for their transparency and collaboration. I watched faces on the screen. Smiles. Nods. Agreement. I realized something then. They thought the story was over. They thought I'd retreat quietly. They thought I'd accept the rewritten version of myself. They were wrong. Because once you see the Slack channel, you can't unsee it. And once you understand how deeply people are invested in keeping you small, you start asking different questions. Not, why don't they support me? But, what happens if I stop protecting them? I didn't make any big moves right away. That's the part people never expect. They assume once you're wronged, you either explode or collapse. I did neither. I kept showing up. Same hours. Same tone. Same steady delivery. But I stopped filling in gaps for other people. I stopped reminding Chris about deadlines he kept missing. I stopped rewriting Sarah's vague slides before leadership reviews. I stopped stepping in during meetings to smooth over confusion that wasn't mine to fix. And almost immediately the cracks started showing. It turns out, when you've been quietly holding a system together for years, people forget what happens when you let go. During one sprint review, Evan asked a question about a metric I usually tracked unofficially. No one answered. Chris tried. He stumbled. Sarah jumped in with a general statement that sounded good but meant nothing. Evan frowned. "Rachel," he asked. I answered calmly, clearly, with numbers. Then I stopped talking. The silence, after that, felt different. Not awkward. Exposed. I noticed Evan watching me more closely after that. Not warmly. Cautiously, like someone realizing a variable they'd written off might actually matter. Meanwhile, the Slack channel changed tone again. Fewer jokes. More defensiveness. More messages asking who was responsible for what. One message stood out. "Rachel's pulling back. Anyone else notice?" Someone replied, "She's probably bitter." Another said, "Let her cool off." As if my engagement was a favor they allowed. At home, things grew tense in subtler ways. John kept asking if I'd decided about the alternative role. I told him I was still evaluating. He nodded, but his questions carried an edge now. Less curiosity, more impatience. One night he asked me if I was dragging this out to prove something. I asked him what he meant. He said, "You don't have to win every battle." That sentence stayed with me, not because it was cruel, but because it revealed something I hadn't wanted to see. To him, my career was a series of battles I should avoid, not ground I was allowed to claim. A few days later, my daughter came home upset. A classmate had taken credit for a project they'd done together. The teacher hadn't noticed. My daughter asked me what she should do. I told her to document her work. Speak up calmly. Not assume fairness would happen automatically. She nodded like she understood. As I spoke, I realized I was giving her advice I hadn't followed myself. That night, after everyone went to bed, I opened the document where I'd been collecting notes. Not emotions. Facts. Dates. Messages. Patterns. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing clarity. At work, HR announced a listening session about team dynamics. Attendance optional. I signed up immediately. The session was framed as a safe space. Cameras optional. Notes confidential. I spoke, not about feelings, about processes. I talked about how feedback should be delivered, how private channels can undermine trust when they replace direct communication, how leadership decisions lose credibility when narratives are coordinated informally. I didn't name the Slack channel, but everyone knew. I could see it in their faces, the stiffness, the sudden interest in their keyboards. After the session, Linda from HR messaged me, "Thank you for your thoughtful input." Later that day, Evan scheduled another one-on-one. This time his tone was different, less managerial, more careful. "We value your contributions," he said, "and we want to make sure you feel heard." I told him feeling heard wasn't the issue. Accountability was. He asked what I wanted. I said I wanted transparency, real feedback, and for internal discussions about my performance to involve me. He said that might not always be feasible. I said then perhaps leadership wasn't as ready as they thought. He didn't like that. At home, John noticed the shift in me. I was quieter but not withdrawn, focused but not distant. It unsettled him. One evening, he asked if I was angry at him. I told him no. Then I added, "But I am paying attention." He didn't ask what I meant. A week later, something unexpected happened. Sarah asked to speak privately. She looked nervous this time. Her usual confidence dulled around the edges. "I feel like things have gotten tense," she said. "I don't want there to be bad blood." I asked her what she meant by bad blood. She sighed. The channel was supposed to be a place to vent. It wasn't personal. I asked her if she would say those things to my face. She hesitated. "That's different," she said. "Exactly." I told her I wasn't angry. I was recalibrating. She asked what that meant. I said it meant I would no longer absorb discomfort that belonged to others. She nodded like she understood, but her eyes told me she didn't. Because recalibration threatens people who benefit from imbalance. That same week, leadership announced the promotion. It wasn't me. It was Chris. The room reacted politely. Congratulations. Applause emojis. I watched his face carefully. He looked proud, nervous, slightly overwhelmed. I felt clear. After the meeting, Evan messaged me. "I know this might be disappointing. Let's talk about next steps." I didn't reply immediately. When I did, I said, "Sure. I'll need clarity on my role going forward." That evening, John brought home a bottle of wine. He said maybe this was a sign to slow down, reassess priorities. I asked him if he would say that if he'd just been passed over. He said that was different. I asked how. He didn't answer. That night, I realized something important. The Slack channel hadn't just exposed my coworkers. It had exposed every place in my life where people were comfortable benefiting from my restraint. At work, Chris struggled almost immediately. Meetings ran long. Decisions stalled. People grew frustrated. Guess who they came to? Me. Quietly. Individually. Asking for help. I helped selectively. I answered questions that fell within my scope. I stopped doing invisible labor. Within weeks, leadership noticed. Evan mentioned growing pains. HR mentioned support structures. Chris asked me for advice. I told him I was focusing on my own deliverables. The Slack channel grew restless. She's not being a team player. She's changed. She's making this harder than it needs to be. I smiled when I read that, because what they called harder was simply fair, and fairness feels like chaos to people used to comfort. At home, John and I had our first real argument in years. He accused me of being distant. I accused him of minimizing. We said things we'd been avoiding. About money. About ambition. About who got to want more. We didn't resolve it that night. But something shifted. For the first time, I wasn't trying to keep the peace. I was asking for honesty. As the weeks passed, rumors started circulating. That I was considering leaving. That I was unhappy. That I was difficult. No one asked me directly, which told me everything. One afternoon, Linda from HR reached out again. We'd like to revisit your career trajectory. I agreed, not because I trusted them, but because I was ready. By then I had options. Not offers yet, but conversations. Recruiters had noticed my work. Quietly, respectfully. I hadn't told anyone at work. And I definitely hadn't told John. Because before I could decide what to do next, I needed to understand something. If I stayed, would I be rewriting the system? Or just teaching it how to hide better? The meeting with HR was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. That alone told me how it would go. Late enough to minimize ripple effects. Clean enough to avoid accountability. I joined the call on time. Linda was there, along with Evan and someone new from senior leadership. A woman named Karen I'd only seen on company-wide announcements. Her presence meant this conversation wasn't about my growth. It was about risk management. They started with appreciation. They always do. They talked about my institutional knowledge, my steady influence, my value to team continuity. Then Karen leaned forward and said, "We're concerned about alignment." Alignment. Another word that sounds harmless until you realize it's used when someone refuses to disappear quietly. I asked them to clarify. They said my recent disengagement had been noticed, that my boundaries were being interpreted as withdrawal, that leadership worried about the message this sent to the rest of the team. I told them I hadn't disengaged. I had simply stopped compensating for gaps outside my role. Evan shifted in his chair. Linda jumped in, smoothing things over. She said maybe there was a misunderstanding, that communication styles differ. I asked them a direct question. Has anyone addressed the private Slack channel and its role in shaping perceptions about me? Silence, just silence. Karen finally spoke. Internal discussions aren't typically subject to review unless they violate policy. I asked if coordinating negative narratives about a colleague without their knowledge violated policy. She said policy wasn't always equipped to address nuance. Nuance. That was the word they used when fairness became inconvenient. I told them then that I was evaluating external opportunities. That changed the temperature immediately. Suddenly, they wanted to talk about retention, about future leadership pathways, about how my career mattered to them. I listened, calmly. Then I said something I'd practiced. I'm not interested in staying somewhere I have to prove I deserve respect. Karen nodded like she understood, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. They asked if I would consider a transition plan, a new role, a fresh start within the company. I asked if that plan included accountability for what had already happened. They said that would be difficult. I thanked them for their time and ended the call. At home, the tension with John thickened. He noticed the recruiters calling, the LinkedIn notifications, the late-night laptop sessions. One evening, he asked if I was planning to leave without talking to him. I told him I was planning to survive. He said that felt dramatic. I asked him why it felt dramatic when I took my career seriously. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, because everything feels like it's changing. That was the first honest thing he'd said in weeks. I realized then that my growth had become a threat. Not because he didn't love me, but because we'd built a life where I was predictable, reliable, adjustable. Change meant renegotiation. And renegotiation scares people who benefit from the current arrangement. At work, Chris's struggles became harder to ignore. Deadlines slipped. Decisions stalled. Complaints bubbled up. In meetings, people started looking to me again, waiting for me to step in. I didn't. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. If leadership wanted Chris, they needed to let Chris lead. The Slack channel reflected the panic. This is getting messy. Leadership's watching closely. Rachel's being strategic. Strategic. That one made me smile. They had mistaken my consistency for passivity. Now they were confusing my restraint with manipulation. A recruiter reached out with a concrete offer. Higher pay, clear scope, remote flexibility. I didn't accept immediately. I wanted to know what staying would cost me. One night, John and I sat at the kitchen table long after our daughter went to bed. I told him about the offer. He went quiet. Then he asked what that meant for us. I told him it meant change, adjustments, conversations we'd been avoiding. He said he was worried I was chasing validation. I said I was chasing agency. That word landed between us like a challenge. He asked if the job was worth the strain. I asked if my stagnation was easier for him to live with. We didn't raise our voices. We didn't insult each other. But something cracked. The next day, Evan asked me to join an emergency meeting. Leadership had concerns about Chris's performance. They wanted my input. I asked why they wanted it now. He said, "You know the team better than anyone." I told him that was true. Then I said I wouldn't undermine a decision they'd already made. He looked surprised. I added, if leadership wanted my judgment, they should have valued it earlier. That was the moment he realized I wasn't bluffing. Later that week, HR circulated a memo about appropriate use of private channels. No names mentioned. No accountability assigned. Too late. The damage had already been done. I received another message from Sarah. I hope we can move past this. I didn't respond, because moving past something requires addressing it, and they wanted erasure, not resolution. At home, John and I tried to normalize things. We talked logistics, schedules, money, but the deeper questions stayed suspended. Who was I allowed to become? And who felt entitled to decide? I accepted the new job offer on a Wednesday afternoon. I didn't tell anyone at work immediately. I wanted to leave on my terms. The Slack channel buzzed with speculation. She's definitely leaving. She's checked out. We should prepare. Prepare. They always did things together. When I finally told Evan, his response was measured, disappointed, professional. He asked if there was anything they could have done differently. I told him yes. Then I listed it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't apologize either. My resignation triggered a chain reaction. Meetings were scheduled. Exit interviews planned. Suddenly, everyone wanted my perspective. I gave it carefully, factually, without cushioning. At home, John struggled. He said it felt like I was leaving more than a job. I told him I was. The night before I gave my notice, I looked at my daughter sleeping. I thought about the example I was setting, not of perfection, but of self-respect. The Slack channel went quiet after my announcement. No jokes, no coordination, just silence. I realized then that their power had depended on my participation. Once I stepped out of the system didn't know what to do with itself. But leaving didn't bring relief the way I expected. It brought clarity, because the betrayal at work had forced me to confront a harder truth. I had been shrinking in more places than one, and leaving was just the beginning. Once I gave notice, everything shifted again. Not dramatically, not explosively, quietly, in the way systems recalibrate when a stabilizing force is removed. People became polite in a way that felt rehearsed. Conversations shortened. Meetings ended faster than usual, like everyone was afraid of saying the wrong thing now that I was officially leaving. Chris avoided me completely. Evan checked in daily not to ask how I was, but to ask what documentation I'd be leaving behind. What processes I'd own that weren't formally assigned. What context I could transfer. It was strange to watch them finally acknowledge how much I'd been holding. I didn't gloat. I didn't withhold information. I documented everything clearly. Clean handoffs. No drama. But I also didn't soften the reality. When Evan asked if something could be simplified, I said no. When Chris asked if I could stay late one evening to help him prep for a review, I said I had other commitments. When HR asked if I'd consider extending my notice period for the sake of continuity, I declined. Each no landed heavier than any argument ever could. The Slack channel didn't disappear, but it changed. No more jokes. No more casual commentary. Just dry logistics and strained professionalism. Without me there as a shared reference point, they had nothing to bond over. At home, the tension with John reached a breaking point. One night, after our daughter went to bed, he asked me if I was happy. The question sounded simple, but I knew it wasn't. I told him I was relieved, energized, still processing. He said he felt like he was losing me. I asked him what part. He struggled to answer. Then he said, the part that needed me. That was the moment I understood how deep this went. For years, my reliability had been woven into our marriage. I managed schedules, remembered details, smoothed over conflicts, made things easier, not just at work. At home, too. My growth disrupted that balance. And instead of adapting with me, John was mourning the version of me that made his life simpler. I told him I wasn't going anywhere, but I wasn't going backward either. He asked what that meant for us. I said it meant we had to talk honestly, not about logistics, about expectations. The next day, something unexpected happened at work. Karen from senior leadership requested a meeting. Just the two of us. Her tone was different this time, less guarded, more direct. She said my resignation had raised concerns higher up, that questions were being asked about team culture, that people were connecting dots. I asked her what she wanted from me. She said she wanted to understand what really happened. I told her I'd already explained. She said she wanted it on record. So I gave it to her, calmly, chronologically, without adjectives. I described the Slack channel, the coordination, the feedback loop, the way support was performed publicly and undermined privately. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked if I would be willing to submit documentation. I asked what would happen if I did. She said there would be an internal review. I asked if anyone would be held accountable. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, I can't promise outcomes, but I can promise visibility. Visibility, the thing they denied me from the beginning. I told her I'd think about it. At home that evening, John noticed I was distracted again. He asked what was wrong. I told him leadership might investigate what happened. He looked uneasy. He asked if I planned to escalate things. I asked why that worried him. He said, because it sounds like conflict, and you don't usually seek that. I told him I didn't seek conflict. I corrected distortions. He sighed, said he just wanted peace. That word again. Peace. I realized then that peace had become a code word, not for harmony, but for silence, for maintaining comfort, even when it required me to swallow things that mattered. The next morning, I opened the email draft Karen had sent requesting documentation. I hesitated. Submitting it would mean burning bridges, possibly inviting backlash, possibly being labeled difficult in ways that followed me. Not submitting it would mean walking away cleanly, but leaving the pattern intact for the next woman. I thought about my daughter again, about what she'd internalize watching me choose quiet over clarity. I forwarded the documentation, not dramatically, not with commentary, just facts. The response was swift. HR acknowledged receipt. Senior leadership thanked me for my candor. Meetings were scheduled. The Slack channel was locked. People started reaching out to me, privately, not to apologize, to ask what I'd said. I didn't tell them. I didn't need to. Within days, Chris was removed from his role, temporarily. Sarah took a leave of absence. Evan was reassigned. No announcements were made publicly. No accountability statements released. But the shifts were visible. At my exit interview, Linda looked different. Less composed. More careful. She asked if I felt the company had handled things appropriately. I said, I think the company responded once the cost of inaction became visible. She didn't push. My last day arrived quietly. People sent polite messages. Some genuine, some obligatory. No one mentioned the Slack channel. As I logged off for the final time, I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. At home, John struggled more openly now. The certainty of my new job made everything real. He asked if I was changing too fast. I told him I was finally changing at my own pace. One night, he admitted something he'd never said before. He said he'd liked that I needed him, that my ambition scared him because it made him feel optional. That honesty cracked something open. We talked for hours. About fear, about roles, about how we both benefited from patterns we'd never questioned. We didn't fix everything that night, but we stopped pretending. My first day at the new job was uneventful, respectful, clear. No private channels. No whispered coordination. Feedback delivered directly. It felt strange, almost unfamiliar. In the quiet moments, I still thought about the Slack channel. Not with bitterness, with clarity, because it wasn't just a workplace betrayal. It was a mirror. It showed me how easily systems form around silence, how often support is conditional, how many people confuse harmony with compliance, and how dangerous it is to mistake being liked for being respected. As I settled into this new chapter, I knew one thing for certain. Walking away hadn't been the end of the story. It had been the first honest sentence. The first few weeks at my new job were calm in a way that felt almost unreal. No side conversations. No private channels humming beneath the surface. People said what they meant, or at least made an effort to. Feedback arrived directly, sometimes awkwardly but honestly. I kept waiting for the catch. When you've lived inside quiet hostility for years, peace doesn't feel peaceful at first. It feels temporary. Still, I did my work. I showed up. I listened more than I spoke. I didn't try to prove anything. And that's when the ripples started reaching me. It began with a LinkedIn message from someone I barely knew. A woman in another department from my old company. I don't know if you remember me, she wrote, but thank you. No explanation. Just that. Then another message came in. Then another. Some were vague. Some were careful. A few were blunt. I was in that Slack channel once. Not the main one. Another one. I left after seeing what they did to you. I thought I was crazy for feeling targeted until I heard what happened with you. They warned us not to talk about it. That's how I knew it mattered. That part stayed with me. They warned us not to talk about it, because silence only works when everyone agrees to maintain it. At my old company, nothing was officially acknowledged. No apology, no public reckoning. But things were changing anyway. Karen emailed me one afternoon. Short, formal. She said the internal review had expanded, that additional channels had been discovered, that leadership was reassessing governance. Governance, a big word for a simple truth. They'd lost control of the story. I didn't reply, not because I was bitter, because I didn't need to be involved anymore. At home, the changes were harder. John tried to be supportive in the ways he understood. He asked about my new coworkers. He cooked dinner more often. He took on school drop-offs without being asked. But something underneath remained unsettled. One night, he admitted he felt behind. Not professionally, emotionally. He said it felt like I'd stepped into a version of myself he hadn't prepared for. I told him neither had I. That was the honest part no one ever says out loud. Growth doesn't arrive fully formed. It stumbles in, disruptive and inconvenient, asking everyone else to adjust, including the people who love you. Our conversations became less about tasks and more about values, what we expected from each other, what we'd assumed without ever discussing. It was uncomfortable, necessary. At work, my manager asked me to lead a cross-functional initiative. She said my reputation for steadiness preceded me. I almost laughed at that. Steadiness, the word they'd used to trap me before. This time, it felt earned instead of limiting. One afternoon, while preparing for that initiative, I received a calendar invite from an unfamiliar name. Chris. No context, just a meeting request. I stared at it longer than I expected to. Part of me wanted to decline immediately. Another part was curious. I accepted. When his face appeared on the screen, he looked different. Not defeated, but stripped of certainty. He didn't waste time. I wanted to apologize, he said. Not for the channel. Not for the coordination. For how things turned out. I didn't realize how bad it would get, he added. It wasn't supposed to be personal. There it was again. That phrase people use when they want absolution without accountability. I didn't interrupt him. He said leadership had been harder than he expected, that he'd felt pressure to assert himself, that he'd relied too much on consensus from the wrong places. I asked him why he was telling me this now. He hesitated, then said, because I lost the role. Permanently. I nodded. Not in satisfaction. In recognition. He said the review uncovered patterns. Not just with me. That the channels had been used before. That decisions had been shaped quietly for years. He said my resignation forced leadership to look. He asked me if I thought he was a bad person. I didn't answer that question. Instead, I said, I think you benefited from a system that rewarded distance from accountability. He didn't argue. He asked if there was anything he could do to make things right. I told him there was nothing he could do for me, but there might be something he could do for the next person. He nodded slowly. The call ended without closure, and that was fine. Not every conversation is meant to heal. Some are just meant to clarify. Later that week, Sarah emailed me. Long, careful, emotional in a restrained way. She said she'd been in therapy since her leave, that she was unpacking patterns of competition she hadn't realized she'd internalized, that she was sorry for participating in something harmful. I read it once, then again. Then I replied with 2 sentences. I appreciate the acknowledgement. I hope you continue doing the work. I didn't offer forgiveness, not because I couldn't, because forgiveness isn't owed on a timeline set by the person who caused harm. At home, John and I hit another rough patch. He confessed he'd told a friend that I was going through a phase. That hurt more than I expected. I asked him why he needed to minimize it. He said it made him feel less afraid. That answer mattered. We talked about fear, about how men are taught to see ambition as a threat when it disrupts familiar roles, about how women are expected to soften their growth to keep relationships intact. He admitted he'd enjoyed being the stable one, the advisor, the quiet authority. My independence challenged that. I told him I didn't need him to be threatened. I needed him to be present. That conversation didn't end neatly, but it ended honestly. One evening, my daughter asked me why I'd changed jobs. I told her I'd outgrown my old one. She asked if it was scary. I said yes. She asked if it was worth it. I said yes again. She smiled like she understood something important. At my new job, someone asked me to mentor a junior employee, a woman early in her career, unsure of her footing. She asked me how to tell when feedback is real and when it's political. I told her to watch where conversations happen. Real feedback doesn't hide. As weeks passed, my old company situation became an open secret in the industry. Recruiters asked careful questions. Colleagues spoke in coded language. The Slack channel became shorthand. "Oh, they had a Slack channel problem," people would say. That phrase followed them. I didn't celebrate it, but I didn't correct it either. Because reputations aren't destroyed by exposure. They're revealed by it. John and I eventually sat down with a counselor. We talked about power, about dependency, about how love can coexist with discomfort if both people are willing to adjust. It was work, real work, harder than anything I'd done at the office. One night, John admitted he was proud of me, not in the way people say it when they're trying to be supportive, but in the way people say it when they've let go of comparison. Months later, Karen reached out one final time. She said leadership had implemented changes, training, oversight, policy revisions. She thanked me again for my honesty. I didn't respond, because the truth doesn't need to be acknowledged repeatedly to remain true. Looking back, I sometimes think about how close I came to staying quiet, to accepting the alternative role, to letting the Slack channel remain invisible. It would have been easier, but ease is often just another word for erasure. I didn't expose them to punish anyone. I exposed the system because it was built on pretending, and pretending always collapses eventually. The only question is how many people get hurt before it does. Even after everything settled, the Slack channel stayed with me, not as anger, as a reflex. I'd read a message at my new job and feel the urge to look for what wasn't being said. I'd sit in a meeting where everyone agreed too quickly and wonder where the real conversation was happening. I didn't distrust people individually. I distrusted harmony that arrived too easily. Betrayal does that. It trains you to listen for echoes. My new manager noticed before I did. One afternoon, she asked why I always asked for feedback in writing after meetings. I told her it helped me stay aligned. She smiled gently and said, "You don't have to defend your position here. If there's a concern, we'll talk about it." I nodded, but it took time for my body to believe what my mind already understood. At home, John and I were still recalibrating. Counseling had opened doors neither of us had planned to walk through. We talked about how support can turn into dependence without anyone noticing, about how being needed can feel like love until it becomes a condition. One session hit especially hard. The counselor asked John what he feared losing if I continued growing. He said after a long pause, relevance. That word sat heavy in the room. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. And honesty, I was learning, isn't always comforting. I realized then that my work situation had only exposed something deeper, a pattern that showed up whenever my expansion required someone else to adjust. At work, at home, even with friends. People who benefit from your consistency often resist your evolution. Not because they're villains, because change rearranges comfort. Around that time, I received an invitation to speak on a panel, a small industry event. Topic: leadership transparency. I almost declined. Part of me worried I'd be seen as the woman who caused trouble, the one who couldn't let things go. But another part of me remembered how often silence protects the wrong things. I accepted. During the panel, I didn't mention Slack. I talked about communication structures, about how power moves quietly when it isn't monitored, about how feedback systems need daylight to work. Afterward, a woman approached me. She said she'd left her company for similar reasons, that hearing someone articulate it without bitterness made her feel less alone. That mattered more than any public validation. At home, John struggled with that attention. He didn't say it outright, but I noticed the way he tensed when people praised my clarity, the way he joked about me becoming corporate famous. One night, I asked him directly if it bothered him. He said he was proud of me. Then he said he was scared that I'd outgrow him. I told him growth wasn't a competition. He asked me how he was supposed to keep up. I told him I didn't need him to keep up. I needed him to walk alongside. That distinction took time to land. Meanwhile, my daughter started asking different questions. Not about work. About fairness. She told me a story about a group project where one girl kept making decisions privately, then presenting them as group consensus. She asked me if that was okay. I asked her what she thought. She said it felt wrong. I asked her why. She said, because it makes everyone else feel small without saying it. I smiled, because that was the Slack channel. Explained perfectly. At work, the junior employee I was mentoring told me she'd spoken up in a meeting for the first time, that she'd asked for direct feedback instead of guessing. She thanked me for encouraging that. I hadn't realized how much my experience had sharpened my clarity, not into cynicism, but into precision. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Late nights when I wondered if I'd burned bridges unnecessarily, if staying quiet would have been easier, if leaving had solved anything at all. Especially when I heard rumors that my old company was stabilizing, that new leaders were settling in, that things were better now. Better. Another word that demands context. Better for whom? One evening, I ran into Evan at a networking event. It wasn't planned, just proximity and inevitability. He looked surprised to see me, then polite. We exchanged pleasantries, talked about industry trends, avoided the past. Eventually, he said, "Things got complicated after you left." I said I'd heard. He said, "You were more central than we realized." I thanked him. Then I said I knew that. He didn't argue. At home, John and I had our hardest conversation yet. He admitted he'd been hoping this phase would pass, that I'd eventually settle back into something more familiar. I told him that version of me didn't exist anymore, not because I was rejecting him, but because I was rejecting silence. We talked about what it would mean to rebuild our marriage without the assumption that I'd always adjust first. It was terrifying. It was necessary. Around that time, Karen reached out again. Not formally. Personally. She asked if I'd consider consulting, helping them redesign communication frameworks. I read the email twice. Then I declined. Not out of spite. Out of boundaries. I told her I didn't want to return to a system I'd had to escape to be heard. She respected that. I started noticing something else then. I was lighter, not because the damage hadn't been real, but because I wasn't carrying it alone anymore. I spoke openly with friends, shared the story without dramatizing it, without downplaying it. Some nodded in recognition. Some looked uncomfortable. That was fine. Truth doesn't ask permission to make people uneasy. John and I reached a fragile equilibrium. Not perfect, not polished, but honest. He stopped framing my growth as temporary. I stopped cushioning my truth to make it easier to digest. We were learning. Slowly, the Slack channel stopped being a wound. It became a reference point, a reminder of what happens when support is performative, when feedback hides, when power organizes itself quietly. I no longer feared private channels. I feared environments that rewarded them. One afternoon, my new manager asked me what kind of leader I wanted to be. I didn't hesitate. One who doesn't need a hidden room to say what matters. She smiled. I realized then that the most lasting consequence of what happened wasn't career-related. It was internal. I trusted myself now, not to be liked, but to be clear. And clarity, once earned, is very hard to take away. The final confrontation didn't arrive with drama. No raised voices. No surprise ambush. It arrived as an invitation. A conference panel. Bigger this time. National. The kind that puts your name on programs and recordings online. The topic was workplace trust and leadership accountability. My name was listed under industry practitioner. My old company's name was listed under case study. They hadn't asked me before submitting it. I found out when a colleague forwarded the agenda with a short message. "Is this you?" I stared at the screen longer than I expected to. This wasn't accidental, and it wasn't neutral. Someone, somewhere, had decided my story was now useful. I emailed the organizer asking for clarification. Polite, direct. She replied quickly, apologetic in tone, but firm in substance. She said leadership from my former company had agreed to participate and thought it would be powerful to include my perspective. Powerful. That word again. The same one people reach for when they want credibility without vulnerability. I didn't respond right away. At home, John noticed the shift in me before I said anything. He asked what was wrong. I showed him the agenda. He read it quietly, then looked up. They didn't ask you, he said. No, I replied. They decided for me. He asked what I wanted to do. That question mattered. Months ago, he would have offered an opinion disguised as concern. Now he waited. I told him I didn't know yet, because this wasn't about exposure anymore. It was about control of the narrative. If I declined, they'd still tell the story. Carefully, selectively, with me framed as a footnote, an example, a cautionary tale. If I accepted, I'd be stepping back into a room that once decided who I was without my consent. I reached out to Karen, not emotionally, strategically. I asked if she was involved. She was honest. She said leadership thought participation would demonstrate growth, transparency, accountability. I asked her if they were prepared to answer unscripted questions. She hesitated. That was my answer. At work, my manager noticed I was distracted. She asked if I wanted to talk. I told her about the panel, about my hesitation. She listened carefully. Then she said, "You don't owe anyone access to your story." That sentence landed differently than all the others before it, because it wasn't advice. It was permission. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was anxious, because I was weighing something deeper. Had I really left silence behind? Or was I just more comfortable speaking when the consequences felt manageable? The next morning, I received another message, this time from someone I didn't expect. Linda, from HR. She said she hoped I was well, that the company had learned a lot since I left, that she admired my strength. Then she said, "I hope you'll consider participating. It would mean a lot." Mean a lot to whom? I realized then that this was the last test, not of them, of me, because saying yes would mean returning as a symbol. Saying no would mean protecting the boundary I'd fought to build. I replied to the organizer. I said I would participate under one condition. No pre-approved questions, no edited recordings, no framing my experience as an isolated incident. I said if they wanted me there, they would have to be willing to sit in full daylight. The response took longer this time. When it came, it was cautious. They said they'd need to check with all parties. 2 days later, they confirmed. The panel went forward. The room was large, bright, neutral. I arrived early, took my seat, recognized faces immediately. Karen, Evan, a new executive I hadn't met. Chris wasn't there. That told me something too. When the moderator introduced us, she spoke carefully, framed the discussion around lessons learned. I waited. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't tell the story the way people expected. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't soften it either. I spoke about systems, about how private channels create power without accountability, about how consensus can be manufactured quietly, about how harm doesn't require malice, just coordination and silence. I talked about what it's like to realize support is performative, how destabilizing it is to discover your professional reality was being negotiated without you. I didn't name individuals. I didn't need to. Then the moderator asked a question that changed the room. She asked Evan what leadership missed. He paused. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't fill the space quickly. Then he said, "We underestimated how much damage silence can do." That was the closest thing to accountability I'd ever heard from him. The audience leaned in. Someone asked whether transparency reforms were enough. I answered before anyone else could. I said reforms only work when people in power are willing to be uncomfortable. Because transparency isn't about sharing good intentions. It's about relinquishing control. The room stayed quiet after that. After the panel, people approached me. Some thanked me. Some asked careful questions. One woman said she'd been in a similar situation and left without speaking up. That seeing me sit there made her feel less foolish. I told her leaving wasn't failure. Staying silent is what teaches systems they're right. Karen approached me last. She thanked me for my honesty. She said the conversation would be uncomfortable internally. I said that was the point. As we were leaving, Evan stopped me. He looked tired. He said, "I wish we'd handled things differently." I said, "So do I." Then I added, "But wishing doesn't change systems. Decisions do." At home that night, John asked how it went. I told him it felt complete. Not resolved. Complete. He nodded. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I used to think strength was keeping things stable," he said. "Now I think it's letting things change." That mattered more than any panel applause. In the weeks that followed, invitations slowed, then stopped. The industry moved on, which was exactly how it should be. At work, I focused on building something new, something cleaner. When junior employees asked me how to navigate politics, I didn't give them tactics. I gave them principles. Say things where they can be heard. Don't confuse kindness with silence. If feedback can't survive daylight, question its purpose. One afternoon, my daughter asked me why people lie at work. I told her most don't think of it as lying. They think of it as managing comfort. She asked if that made it okay. I said no. I said it made it common. That night, I realized something important. I no longer felt the need to be understood by the people who had betrayed me. I had said what needed to be said. I had protected what needed protecting. And most importantly, I had stopped measuring my integrity by how quietly I could carry discomfort. The Slack channel had started as a betrayal. It ended as a boundary. And boundaries, once drawn, don't require explanation. They just require respect. Time does something strange after betrayal. It doesn't erase it. It resizes it. Months passed after the panel. Then more. Seasons changed. New routines replaced old ones. The Slack channel stopped feeling sharp and started feeling instructive, like a chapter one could close without forgetting what it taught me. At work, I settled into a rhythm that didn't require performance. People disagreed openly. Feedback landed where it belonged. When someone had an issue with my work, they told me. When they didn't pretend. It sounds small. It isn't. Because once you've lived inside coordinated dishonesty, directness feels radical. At home, John and I weren't perfect. We still argued, still misunderstood each other sometimes. But the ground rules had changed. I no longer apologized for wanting more, and he stopped treating my ambition like a temporary disturbance. We renegotiated things that had gone unspoken for years. Who carries emotional labor? Who adapts? Who gets to grow without explanation? Some nights were uncomfortable, but they were real. One evening, while cleaning out old files on my laptop, I found the document where I'd first listed names and messages from the Slack channel. Dates, quotes, patterns. I stared at it for a long time. Then I deleted it, not because it didn't matter anymore, but because I didn't need proof to trust my memory. That's another thing betrayal steals from you, if you let it. Confidence in your own perception. I wasn't giving it that power. Occasionally, someone new would hear the story and ask if I regretted how things unfolded, if I regretted not staying, if I regretted escalating, if I regretted speaking. The answer surprised even me. No. What I regretted was how long I believed support meant safety. Because what I learned is this: people can support you emotionally while undermining you structurally. They can clap for you in public while arranging your limits in private. And if you never look behind the curtain, you'll keep wondering why the ceiling never moves. I thought about the Slack channel less as a betrayal and more as a revelation. It showed me how power actually works when it isn't named, how easily narratives are built, how silence gets dressed up as professionalism. It also showed me something about myself, that I had been trained to absorb discomfort quietly, to interpret exclusion as feedback, to adjust instead of question. Once I saw that pattern, I couldn't unsee it. Not at work, not in my marriage, not anywhere. One afternoon, my daughter came home excited. She'd corrected a teacher who had mixed up her contribution on a group assignment. Not rudely, just clearly. The teacher apologized. My daughter shrugged and said, "I just didn't want the wrong story to stick." I laughed, because that was it. That was the entire lesson. Stories stick, and the people who control them decide who gets promoted, who gets doubted, who gets erased. The Slack channel was an attempt to write my story without me. Seeing it didn't just hurt. It gave me my authorship back. I don't tell the story because I think I handled everything perfectly. I didn't. There were moments I stayed quiet too long. Moments I softened when I shouldn't have. Moments I waited for fairness instead of demanding clarity. But I tell it because I know I'm not the only one who's been smiling in meetings while being discussed elsewhere. I know I'm not the only one who's felt support evaporate the moment it threatened someone else's comfort. And I know I'm not the only one who's wondered whether speaking up was worth the cost. So I'll leave you with this. If you found a Slack channel where your coworkers pretended to support you while coordinating against you, if you realized the truth about your place in the room by accident, if you saw your name reduced to assumptions and jokes behind closed doors, what would you do? Would you stay quiet to keep the peace? Would you confront it and risk being labeled difficult? Would you walk away and protect your sanity? Or would you do what I eventually did and decide that silence was more expensive than honesty? I'd really like to know, because behind closed doors, stories are always being written. The question is whether you're allowed to read yours before it's finished.